Good afternoon. Well, I don't know about you, but it's been an incredibly inspiring day for me. I've taken copious notes on several different things, and so I'm so happy to be here again. I'm Amy Williams. I'm Vice President of the CMMC program for Co-Fire Federal. We are super happy to be a sponsor. I was actually scheduled to be on vacation this week, and when that fell through, my first thought was, yay, I got to go to Uniting Women in Cyber. So thank you so much, Deb, for everything you do for the community. Thanks to everyone for being here. It's my great honor and distinct pleasure to invite up the next panel on compliance, which is a subject very near and dear to my heart, and I will echo Allie's comments that Sentinel Blue is fantastic, Andy is a good friend, and so I won't take any more of your time. I'll just invite them on up. And oh, just you. Okay.
Am I on? Hello? Hi. Hello, everybody. Andy Sauer, Sentinel Blue. Those super cool pens that I've seen floating around, the cardboard and plastic, those are fully recycled pens because that's how cool we are. Thank you, everybody, again. I have a fantastic panel to introduce you all to today and a great topic on regulation, what we'll effectively call the carrot or stick approach in cybersecurity. First up, I'd like to introduce to the stage Jen Morris, partner at Ward & Berry. Leisha Hurt, an industry advisor at Splunk. The Dr. Nikki Robinson, senior technical staff, lead security architect at IBM, and author, who we'll talk about. Sabine Malik, VP of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Rapid7. And Eve Wood, security architect at Zscaler. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me up here. You all have the hard job today. I have the easy job, which is I just get to ask some questions, and we have some pretty loaded questions. As I told Jen before we came up here, I'm looking to create as much controversy as we possibly can today.
Boy.
So your hottest takes, your most controversial opinions, I would love to have. First, if we could let the crowd know a bit about yourselves, quick intros, and we'll just go down the line. We'll start with you, Jen.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here. I'm Jennifer Morris. I'm a partner at Ward & Berry Law Firm, and I practice in the areas of cybersecurity and government contracts. So exactly what this area crosses between the Reston corridor and the government, that's my specialty. I enjoy working with UIC. I'm a member of the board here, and I'm excited to be able to be here to speak.
My name is Leisha Hurt. I am a cyber wonder warrior. I am a Yorkie dog mom for all the dog moms and cats out there. I am native to DMV area. It's home for me. And I also happen to be an industry advisor for Splunk, which is now a Cisco company. So I support the federal government, and I have the privilege and honor to work with defense, federal civilian, and intelligence agencies, helping them to drive digital resilience aligned to their mission outcomes. Prior to Splunk, I spent some time in the private sector industry. Don't hold this against me, but I used to be an auditor. I used to be a bank examiner, a GRC leader, and also a CISO in highly regulated environments where carrots and sticks were both present. So I look forward to this conversation today and learning from this phenomenal brain trust on the stage with me today.
Hi, Nikki Robinson. I'm an STSM and security architect. I joke by day. By night, I'm also an adjunct professor. I teach in the realm of incident response, digital forensics, background in IT operations. So I started in the public sector on help desk for about 10, 11 years in the IT space, moved into cybersecurity. And my favorite topic, vulnerability management. I'm also an author. I've written 2 books, and I'm excited to dig into this topic today.
Hi, I'm Sabine Malik. I'm the Vice President for Global Government Affairs, Partnerships, and Public Policy at Rapid7. And Nikki and I were just talking that I think Rapid7 may have been in her book somewhere. We're going to try to find that after we speak here. I come at this from a different lens. So I come at this from, I was a diplomat for 10 years, and so worked on a lot of this stuff related to what would we do in this space when we think about internationalizing a lot of the standards that are underlying a lot of the compliance regimes that we now see, both from from the United States, but also globally. What does that then mean to think about our innovation economies, just our economic issues writ large when we talk about this space? And then more importantly, when we talk about tech policy just generally, why is this still something that we still hear many, many times over, that compliance is very cost prohibitive, but at the same time, we have to think about other ways that public-private partnerships can deal with this. How do we do this better with all the stakeholders when we think about how stakeholders can also take some of the burden off from just governments and the private sector, and to think about third-party ways to do this as well. So over to you.
Absolutely. I'm Eve Wood. I have been in technology for 36 years. I'm probably the least credentialed person up here. So I don't even have a college degree. What I do have is 17 years worth of cybersecurity experience, especially doing digital forensics and incident response in the federal and the Fortune 100 space. I also spent a fair amount of time doing compliance for large-scale organizations. My perspective on this is really going to be more of an operational perspective and from a corporate perspective as opposed to a government and a policy perspective. And so that's what I have to bring to the discussion here.
Just quick shout out to the Cyber Guild. Like, way to pull together such a power panel. This is an insane amount of talent.
Shout out to the Cyber Guild.
So with such an expert panel, I certainly want to set the stage, sort of a backdrop here, and just talk about cybersecurity broadly. What I see, I think what most of us see as cybersecurity professionals, is a pretty wide gap in terms of where we are, where we need to be, and the momentum or the acceleration not matching the widening of that gap. Sabine, I want to start with you, maybe talk about why do we see that gap widening? Why does it feel like, or in truth, seem like we're not making the ground that we need to make?
So you want the hot take, right? Or you want the...
I said court as much controversy as we can. We're
Yeah.
on camera too, so.
So I think part of it, look, is the nature of the task at hand. Things change in terms of the landscape that we're dealing with. The way in which software at its core, in terms of being a fixed good in the way that we normally think of when we think of safety, which I also think when the internet was developed was sort of a very later configuration of sort of when thinking about design and how we're thinking about this. So I think from the core, we're dealing with the problem of reactivity. And it's just always sort of one foot behind in terms of just saying, like, what are we doing with this and how do we get ahead of it? I think if we kind of start with the place of this is not a thing to be resolved, this is a thing to be managed, and you think about risk, then I think you are in a much better place than sort of thinking that you're going to get to, we're going to conquer and we're never going to have a problem. And I think that is so great in terms of storytelling. I mean, it's so nice to think about like a beast and someone with a sword and sort of this like narrative. And I think we have to change the narrative, frankly. Like, I love stories, but I'll be honest, I don't necessarily like sword and like, sort of stories of that thing. I think everybody can be a hero in their story, and there doesn't have to be demons. We don't have to demonize. I think we have to think more about constructively, how do we actually build this in from the ground up? And if we think about it from that perspective as something that everybody can play a part in, then I think you get to a better place of managing their risk. My grandmother, my mother, my dad, when I talk to them still, I'm the child that gets the phone because they think I just do IT policy, and so I still get the call. And they say to me, we're seeing all this stuff now, we get all these alerts, what do we do? Imagine someone who's in the security operations center, imagine someone who's in a watchtower somewhere who's thinking about all these alerts that they're getting. It's overwhelming, but you have to also think about prioritizing what do we want out of this moment in time? What are we trying to get at? And I think we do have lack of clarity. So that's my hot take.
Do you all think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what sort of the objective here? Like, what I kind of hear in there is sometimes there's this outcome orientation of, we're gonna vanquish the beast, we're gonna get secure, and like, hey, we're gonna cross that line. You're never gonna get there. Do you all think that's true? Like, is it a misunderstanding that we all have?
Well, I think that most organizations treat it as a risk proposition, right? So it's all about risk versus expense in the corporate world, right? Which is, what's our risk? What's the risk of a breach? What's the expected expense of a breach? And then how much are we willing to spend in order to try to prevent that, right? Where the challenge comes in my personal opinion, and you want to get controversial,
Go.
right? So, we do a lot to regulate, and I think it's a good idea that we do a fair amount to regulate organizations based on their security posture. Where we fail, and where policy fails, I think, is we don't do enough to regulate the vendors themselves. And what I mean by that is your Microsofts, your Apples, your the folks who are producing commercial versions of Linux, those types of things. There's way too many vulnerabilities. There's way too many 0 days that come out, and a lot of it is stuff that could have been avoided by secure code technique. So then the question then becomes is how do you regulate or how do you enforce some kind of compliance in that space, which frankly, to my knowledge, has never been done really. We will happily go and regulate and go after a corporation and drive down on them requirements for secure coding and those types of things. But in the end, if Microsoft releases a buggy release of Windows that anybody can compromise, where's the penalty, right? We're all stuck with them, and we can't get out of using them. So what are we doing to solve that problem, I think is where it comes from.
The initial premise being there's sort of a widening gap. First of all, do you all agree that's the case? Do you see that? And do you have any thoughts on why we're seeing that? Like we're not keeping pace with, defending against things as they progress?
I think that there's multiple reasons. We all live and work in the government space, and so when you think about government regulation, they're really doing the best that they can. But if you know anything about the government acquisition cycle, then you know the timeline that takes, and so...
Like the whole crowd laughed at that.
That's right.
I guess we know how many of you work in government. Or with them.
You know the timeline that it takes, and the government can't do it fast enough. So the government can't manage the risk timely. It is always reactive, as was said earlier, and I think that plays into the widening gap. So government comes out and it keeps regulating as it can through its different agencies, but it's not keeping pace. I think something on the commercial side needs to be addressed.
Do you have anything you want to add?
I have kind of an academic spin on this. I think it's a terminology thing. Sometimes I think it's a definition thing. When we say cybersecurity, it's such a big encompassing thing. What does cybersecurity mean? Does it mean that it is compliance and regulations? Does it mean it's controls? Does it mean it's vulnerability management? So I think if we can define that better, what are we talking about? What do we really mean? I think that can be really helpful. I'll take a little example, and I'm totally biased because I'm going to say vulnerability management, which is my favorite thing. But just that term, vulnerability management, what does that mean when we say vulnerability management? Does it mean patching? Well, maybe a piece of it, but it also means controls. It also means compliance. It also means networking and engineering. So it's a number of different things when we're talking about vulnerabilities. And I see people saying it's like, well, it's a CVE ID. It's like, well, yes, those are classified vulnerabilities, but there's a lot more out there that we're not talking about when it comes to vulnerability management. So I think for me, sometimes it's about really defining the problem space. What are we trying to solve for?
So clearly we have a problem. There is that gap. And so the conversation to have today is one of our key tools at our disposal is regulation, and we have this carrot and stick sort of binary to it. And Alicia, I want to open it up to you and talk about whether the carrot or the stick are the right approach. Is there a right approach? Is there a balance? And maybe some thoughts on what that balance might be.
Andy, you gave me the hardest question. That's a
well, this is likely a $1 billion question.
It is, and I think the answer is you have to strike the right balance for both, right? There's a place at the table for both. And so when I think about carrots, I think about incentives. I just want to break this down for people that are not in the space. When I think about the stick, I think about the punitive measures, right? And so incentives are geared to really reward or encourage improvements in cybersecurity for companies, whereas when we think about the stick or the punitive measures, we think about penalties. And I think the reality is they both have a purpose, right? When you think incentives, you think about encouraging transparency, encouraging openness. On the flip side of that, punitive measures, it ensures accountability. And I think the reality is you need a mix of all of those things. And so I think carrots and sticks are necessary. Depending upon where you are in the industry, you may have more so carrots and more so sticks or opposite. But But the reality is, I think when you look at both, you have to really assess where you are in the industry, whether you're in government or private, and really think about what regulatory frameworks are important for your business outcomes. Take a risk-based approach, which I heard someone say, and really think about creating a holistic view where you have both. Probably not the controversial answer you wanted, but that's my.
It's all right, there is time yet.
We'll get you there, Andy.
We'll get there.
So at least I'm not here to opine too much, but I see a lot of stick. I don't see a lot of carrot.
Yep.
And I'm interested to hear from the panel, what ideas are out there as carrots, or what are you seeing? Carrots, as we mentioned, essentially being incentives, good reasons to do something versus the fear-based stuff that we see the stick being. To Jen and Nikki, I kind of want to open up to you all first. For carrots, for incentives to improve cybersecurity maturity, what kind of ideas are we seeing? And more importantly, are we seeing anything that's functional and effective?
Those are two very different answers. I think, are we seeing something that's effective? I think both our carrots and our sticks, this is my personal opinion, are failing. I think we don't have enough people on the government side or the commercial side engaged with the government to enforce the sticks. So the sticks are there, but how often are they enforced? That's why we are where we are, not as often as they need to be. The carrots, they're very few and far between. The carrot is, do you still want to do government with the business with the government? Do you want to be, are you a regulated entity from the FTC? I mean, if you want to stay in those industries, those are your incentives, but that's not really enough.
That's sort of a shadow stick.
Correct.
Here's the incentive, stay in or else you get kicked
Right.
out.
And it's probably controversial, but maybe a tax incentive for commercial entities. Because the government can't regulate every entity of commerce, but it's the commercial entities that are often exposed. And so how can we help them? Maybe some tax incentive would help.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. I think, Jen, you bring up a good point. The incentives are limited. The other ones that I think about in addition to the taxes are grants and funding, particularly in industries like nonprofit where they're getting funding to improve their cybersecurity because they don't have the resources. Another area which some may say, oh, not so great, but cyber reduced premiums. So not sure how many people are aware of cyber liability insurance, but it's similar to your home insurance, right? You're incentivized by reduced premiums to have strong cybersecurity, to have strong compliance, similar to like your home insurance, right? You get a credit if you have a fire extinguisher. If you have an alarm system, you're supposed to get a discount. I think some companies are seeing that and some are not. And so I think grants and funding is one, the tax incentives for the cyber insurance and then the deductions are some other incentives, but they're far few in between when you look at the carrot side of the house.
Yeah, I feel like if we did have more carrots or more incentives, I think one of the benefits of that would be better information sharing too. Because I'm always thinking, cybersecurity, how do I make things better? It's automation, it's scripts, like just getting very technical, right? Those are all the things that make my life easier on the IT tech side. So if we could have more incentives to do that, I feel like there would be more sharing, it'd be easier to get information like that so that some of the maybe smaller to medium-sized businesses could get a lot of that automation available easily accessible, which would make those things a lot easier.
So I get the sense there's not a lot of incentives available. And then there's sort of like an informal incentive of it's good investment. At least I think most cybersecurity professionals would explain to their organizations, this is good investment. There's good return you get on improving cybersecurity. Of course, the big tool that we see, the big stick that we see wielded, even Sabine, I know in your roles you see this in terms of regulation, in government affairs. Well, the government is the purveyor of that particular stick, and Eve, I know you see that in your work, having to do that stuff. Jen sort of set us with the first controversial take that might cause some action up here, but that is, are regulations working? Is the stick as a motivator in its current form working?
So I don't think it is. I mean, I think I'll take incident reporting. There are almost 50 different incident reporting regimes just in the federal government alone. And I'm really trying to understand from a mission point of view, if again, we're talking about one mission, there's some information that specific agencies have in terms of their mission that would require some difference. but frankly, we don't have a unified understanding of why do we even need that information. Timeliness is kind of assumed that it is the faster you get it, the better your knowledge. I think some of that is also, frankly, a little bit of I want to know before anybody else does so I can control the narrative. And I think that's hurting because we don't need to have that many differences in terms of arbitrary hours in terms of why people are getting that information. You know, having a report once regime and then having people think about exceptions for why they need that information quicker is a better way to think about reciprocity as a program design and regulation than each person sort of developing their own regime out into the wild and then all of a sudden coming back and saying, yeah, we have too many. And what did we think about? And I say that with just incident reporting, but I think you can go to vulnerability disclosure, you can think about other security requirements. Even secure by design, I think, is great conceptually, but it sort of got proliferated into the world without any detail as to what do people want to secure by design. And as my colleague was saying, there are some things that frankly are more about the way sort of the product piece of this works. So where does product regulation fit in here? I think that's been weak here, frankly. And there's more of sort of, I think, what I would call upstream decision making around what happens after the incident. But what are we doing downstream to prevent that, which is what my colleague was talking about too, in terms of other ways and methods that can be discussed more from a product design, product focused way. And I think that right now, because of the way that we also think about how regulatory agencies in the United States are sort of, there's no one jurisdictional regulator. I don't think one regulator is how we're going to solve this either. But I think we have over 70 plus committees of jurisdiction on cyber in the US Congress alone. When you look abroad, they really scratch their head. They're like, we don't know who to talk to. And you know, when you think about the way in which that then proceeds to sort of think about how the pen should be held on who's determining carrots and sticks, it's really confusing. So I think that's part of the issue is the carrot and stick is not just, do we have more carrots and sticks? It's where are we applying those and what do we need to really focus on in this iteration, in this chapter of where we are in the cyber journey.
So I'm going to take a slightly different point of view on this, which is in the global cybersecurity survey that was done by the World Economic Forum, 73% of respondents in the private sector said that regulation did improve their cybersecurity circumstances. I don't think any of us would be here really if we hadn't seen the beginning of real regulation and evaluation of material weakness and financial statements that was brought on by Sarbanes-Oxley after Enron, right? So I think that I'm an all-stick person really. So, and
controversial. I like
well, I mean, so here's the thing, right? So my family's from Kentucky, from rural Kentucky, right? They're all a bunch of coal miners. So I'm going to slip in a little bit here and just say that, you know, the coal mines didn't really get better until people started having to pay the price for bad safety. That being said, it's the same with cybersecurity. People were not paying any attention to cybersecurity despite the issues that had already started to arise at that point until we started seeing regulation and requirements, PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, go on, just continuing on and on, right? Privacy laws. So I think that in the end, that really the stick is effective, and government does a great job of telling you what the bad thing is going to cost you. What the government doesn't generally do a very good job of is telling you how you avoid the bad thing. Right? They just, you know, here's the bad thing it's going to cost you. Now we're going to build a regulation. Then something happens, and so now we build another reg. Now we add to the regs, and that's, you know, you look at airlines, you know, the NTSB. You look at, you know, energy sector. What doesn't matter? Pick one. When bad things happen, they're really good at reacting to that and putting together yet another piece of requirement for the regulation. Where it falls on the private sector, and like I said, I'm not in government, right? So I don't have to deal with 50 different reporting formats and all that kind of stuff. It's not my problem. If I work in retail, I have one. If I work in healthcare, I have something else. It's not nearly as onerous in that respect. Where the challenge comes in is really in the smaller businesses. And coming back to the things you guys talked about with incentives, my problem with incentives is we're in a country that doesn't like to pay taxes, right? So what do we do with, how do we deliver incentives and yet still provide enforcement? And that comes back to the other issue, which is how do you enforce a rule if you have no inspectors? If nobody's there to inspect this stuff and make sure it's being done right, then how do you enforce those rules without paying taxes? These are the issues. Again, I come back, I'm all stick, but the problem still comes back to the same issue, which is the stick's the only thing we have to work with right now because we have not looked at alternative methods of inspecting or evaluating the security posture of anything other than critical infrastructure, right? So that's kind of my 2 cents worth.
So panel, Eva's declared for the stick. I wonder how you all feel. Is she, that balance, is that the balance that we're gonna have? Is that what we all need to sort of come to terms with? Because I tend to kind of see a bit of the same.
I think that's the only option. While I love the concept of incentives, I haven't seen anything be effective and work. We've all talked about that and agreed on that. And I think the regulation and the fear and the threat of paying money, the companies always evaluate the risk versus the money, is the incentive that seems to be working. And you look at the DOJ Cyber Fraud Task Force, and you're talking the False Claim Act, you're talking millions and millions of dollars of penalties, and companies want to avoid it. So when they come to me as a lawyer, you run down the parade of horribles about how much non-compliance is going to cost them or could cost them, or that they can no longer do business in their industry or with the government. And generally, that's enough fear to make them compliant. So the stick is working to some extent. Is it fully effective? No.
And I will go back again to some of the things that we're talking about are actually industry-led practices. They're not by the government. And so I think we have to also be very clear, not everything that people do in this space is actually government imposed. A lot of the banking stuff is that they took it onto themselves because they felt that they could do it faster, better, cleaner, instead of waiting for this kind of waiting and seeing approach. And so they all banded together and were like, okay, we'll do this because we know that we don't want to not be seen on the wrong side of this, but we also feel like we need to be able to kind of do this in a way that's a little bit faster. And so what I'm suggesting by that is I think a stick approach would work if we also had other approaches in terms of the way government is doing its business right now. CERCIA, when you sort of looked at...
Can you give a quick background?
Yeah, so cyber incident law was going through a couple rounds of, came out through Congress, then CISA did rulemaking. Rulemaking process ran almost 2 years. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's correct. And just over the summer, came out with the scope when Congress, and you looked at some of the congressional folks that had written it, said, this is way beyond what we expected. And I think CISA was trying to also think about all the things that had changed in the 2 years since that law then went into rulemaking and how the landscape has changed. And goes back to this idea of that was with that authority to sort of think about, okay, how do we provide some more sticks in rulemaking and the details? But the landscape keeps changing. And the scoping mechanism of where you would then ground this changes. So I'm not saying that's an excuse, but I think there is something about the way that this is working in time and in the space that we are in right now that is not commensurate to the risk at hand. And I think that some of the carrot here is to think about how the industries themselves can band together. Look, yes, as much as like companies, are sort of like good or bad, money or no money, nobody also wants to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, to be known as the poster child for something bad. And that's also a very powerful incentive. And so I think the thing is that folks are really trying sometimes to figure out what should we do, how should we prioritize, what should we prioritize. Money is a big motivating factor. I'm not trying to limit that at all. But what I'm also saying is that sometimes clarity as to what it is the purpose of what are we doing here can really motivate groups and people and organizations to do this sort of stuff on their own. And as my legal colleague can speak to, some industry best practices do set the standard. They end up being used by the law, when it's codified in law. So it's not like these two things are sort of not working always in sort of not in tandem with together, or sort of can be really good examples. I just think part of where we're at right now is we're also, I think, trying to solve too many things at the same time, because it's very difficult to think about both at the same time product quality, which is some of this is, and you've seen people now refer to vulnerabilities as bad software. And yes, that could be the case. But I still think that if we're in a world where if you're, again, saying that everything is going to be zero, there's no fault, there's nothing that's going to happen, I can't think of any product liability regime that creates that kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong here. So I think, again, we have to sort of model that in terms of what is it that we're sort of putting out, what's the risk and reward, and then how do we sort of think about the innovation piece in this too as well? Because some of the ways that people have solved these issues still is, yes, companies themselves have sort of really taken up the mantle and have decided that that's no longer acceptable. Or then you're in a situation where we're still, like people feel like this is a community thing. They really want to sort of be seen as like heroes and sort of say like, I found this thing that nobody else did. Think about bug bounty programs and other things that have been created to help do that. It's not like a community in other places. I don't know, like the last time I looked at my hairdryer, it didn't have that white tag anymore of putting it into the tub. But, I still think, like you guys remember those. I'm dating myself maybe, but like I think at this point, folks understand what they're doing with their hairdryer, right? So, but I think at a certain point we have to sort of think about like what's baseline now, and then how do we solve the next order layer of things. And this is where people will say, oh, the magic bullet is AI, we'll fix all the code with all this sort of stuff. We're adding more vulnerability, more complexity, we're adding more assets all the time. I still think that part of that is really about how do we look at the landscape clearly, and I don't know if we're really doing that and understanding the problem sets between what government needs to solve for and where can industry also do a better job of honing in on that risk and problem.
I want to spend a little bit of time on the private industry side of this equation, because we are going to come after regulation and government. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, but I think what you've kind of posited is there is an approach where private industry can kind of, and we are seeing signs of them moving along on maturity without the need of a government stick sort of chasing them down. I think, well, what I've heard directly from people in the government, I operate in the DoD space, and so we interact with a lot of the DoD's folks. They tend to have the opinion that if industry could do it, they would have done it, and they would have been further along. I wonder if you all, think, can private industry band in this way and achieve, the outcome that the government seems to think needs to happen without being chased by a stick?
Everybody's looking at me.
You're the stick person.
I am the stick person. The answer to your question, I think, is can they? Sure. Will they? No. You have to remember, you have two different models of operation here. You have private corporations which are focused on one thing and one thing only, money, right? When you are in the government space, that's not, you have a mission, right, based on what piece of the government you're in and what you're doing, right? So, if it's the military, their mission is to, quote unquote, is to protect the country, right, and whatever that entails, right? If you are in the intelligence industry, it is to gather intelligence and protect the company, so on and so forth. But when you are in setting aside nonprofits, mind you, for just a moment, in a for-profit industry, we still live pretty much by shareholder value, right? And so part of the problem that you run into is this, back in the 80s, there was a time when you couldn't fine a company for polluting more than $25,000 a day. But if that company was dumping $100,000 worth of waste every day that they weren't paying to have it reprocessed, or they were saving $100,000 by dumping, and guess what? They're going to keep doing it, right? So can private industry do it? They can. So a perfect example of that is PCI. The payment card industry was one of the earliest compliance frameworks. It was produced by an industry, not produced by the government, and it was a requirement for taking credit cards, which everybody had to do, right? And now everybody really has to do. But the reason that happened is because of loss, right? Of monetary loss, especially for the banks, right? So it really comes down to how much money are they willing to lose versus how much they have to, again, the risk proposition, how much am I going to lose if there's an event versus how much I gain by ignoring it, right? The reason I'm all stick is not because I want to create a bunch of regulations and tell them how to do this thing, right? Private industry is learning how to do it very well, right? And if you take the time to do it, it can turn out to good effect. I've seen it. I've seen the inside of organizations that have good cybersecurity programs who avoid a lot of potential breaches. But I've seen plenty of bad cybersecurity. It's all a function of what they can handle. But at the end of the day, when that stick is big enough, they'll do it, right? Either it's got to be a monetary outcome from the free market or it's going to have to be regulated. So that's it. There's not really another option.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that from a private sector, just going back to my prior life. So I actually joined a company that had experienced probably one of the largest data breaches in the US in the financial sector. And just going back to her point about, you know, if you crack the stick, people will be motivated to do the right thing. This company had a data breach of over 100 million customer records, including their credit cards, speaking of PCI and things like that. They had cyber insurance, and they were covered for 50% of the $138 million of losses and damage, but they were not covered for the other 50%. And so as you can imagine, this is the financial sector. So the regulators were at the table. They had a memorandum understanding, which means that if you don't get your house in order, you could have to cease operations and shut down. And so they hired a gazillion people, me included, after, to come in, right, and get their house in order. So going back to your point about stick, if there's a risk of your business being shut down or you not being able to do business or move forward, you will do the right thing. It's just unfortunate that it has to come to that for people to invest in cybersecurity.
So I'm a carrot person. I've been a little quiet, but I think it's because I'm a carrot person. Partially because, you know, when we talk about compliance and regulation and frameworks, we're talking about reporting, we're talking about technical controls, we're talking about all the technical components, but there are human beings on the other side of the computer that are in charge of doing those things. And I like the carrot approach when we talk about human behavior, right? How do you change and adapt human behavior to do the right thing, right? To kind of do the right thing that they're supposed to do in cybersecurity. I find I do that better with carrots, personally. I'll give an example. When we talk about vulnerabilities, right? Low, medium, high, critical. You got to fix the highs and criticals, right? Because regulations, compliance. How do I convince someone that lows and mediums are just as important? How do I convince them that they need to also do this too? Don't just focus on the criticals and highs, because lows and mediums can be exploitable too, right? It's just a vulnerability score, and there's a lot more data around that too. So what I do is I change the way I discuss lows and mediums and change that to an exploitable vulnerability conversation, and changing the mindset to, oh, it's not just, it's above an 8, you know, an 8 to a 10, oh, it's also exploitable. Maybe I should try to fix that too. So I think sometimes it's also about the way we talk about it and explain why it's important, and not just, you have to do it because I said so. So anyway, I'm a carrot person, I'm sorry.
Speaking of doing things because it's said so, so regulation being one of the tools, the big tool the government uses. In my world, CMMC is the looming threat that the defense industry faces, codifying existing requirements, but making third-party assurance occur. One of the key criticisms I certainly hear in the SMB segment is these are esoteric, these regulation frameworks are hard to understand, they're very technical at times, they're very vague at times. My question to lawyer Jen here is why? Does it have to be this way?
Nothing like putting me in the hot seat. I think part of it is what I heard earlier, is that the government tries to solve too much when it thinks about things. You know, it goes through the regulatory process, and then it goes back before the regulation is published and says, yeah, but we forgot A. And I think CMMC is one of those things that did that. You know, the foundation of CMMC came out in 2013.
Yeah.
with the 110 requirements. So can anyone in industry really say they're surprised by CMMC coming now with a stick instead of a carrot? They shouldn't be. It's been around for a long time. Why does it have to be so complex? I just think it's too complex of a problem to solve with all one regulation. And then you get different regulators, and then you have to hire somebody like me to figure out what they all mean when you read them together. And I wish for industry as a whole, including the legal industry, that people could just make it in plain English so that companies, small businesses, large businesses, could easily understand to avoid some of the complexity.
Yeah, as a follow-up to my question, these are esoteric, they're hard to understand. You need experts most times to put in requirements coming out of one of these regulatory frameworks. And I wonder, is there a path for simplifying it, or is this just a new business capability, a business competence or organizational competence, whether you're a nonprofit or otherwise, that all organizations have to add and respect the same way they do, HR practices and good financial practices? Is this just here to stay in the way it is?
I think yes. I mean, it's not going away. Technologies, we're not going to go backwards. Now we're moving forwards with AI. The regulations are going to get more complex, even harder. It's not like we can go back to before the internet, although some of us may want to. We can't really go back, so it's not going to change. I think it's only going to continue.
I think it comes down to a safety issue or a similar concept. I think it's been mentioned several times now, which is that Sabine started that conversation, which is we're trying to do too much, right? In the government, the government's trying to regulate or wrap its arms around too much and too much detail of what's being done. If you look at certain areas, when they're done well, if you look at certain areas of the federal government, and I always go back to the NTSB, it's one of my favorite examples. If something goes wrong and the NTSB is paying attention, which they should be, they're going to investigate, they're going to make a determination, they're going to figure out what broke, they're going to tell whoever it is that broke it to fix it, right? And then somewhere that's going to get codified and they're going to look for it again, right? Cybersecurity is always supposed to be that way. We're supposed to be doing continual marginal improvement in the space. So what really should be happening is you start with a base set, NIST, pick one, right? Must comply with X. Interchange must require these particular requirements, right? Allowing too much private industry input into that process muddies the water real fast, right? Because everybody's got competing interests. You got people who have their own protocols they want to use, et cetera. But at the end of the day, when you regulate something, the idea would be to say, I want to solve today's problem today, right? And then tomorrow's problem is going to come along, and we're going to have to modify what we're doing to solve that problem. That's just the nature of life, for starters, right? So I think that that's really a better approach than trying to wrap your arms around what are all the possibilities that might happen. Even if you're a year behind or 2 years behind, you can catch up relatively quickly if you're doing fast marginal improvement on small things rather than trying to just grab it all.
So cybersecurity, again, in the SMB world in particular where I operate, it's definitely seen as a burden. Financial burden, labor burden, understanding burden. It's just sort of difficult to do. It's also this strategic national security problem that at the highest echelons of government we're trying to resolve for. We're now seeing the cyberspace is where the next conflict will largely take place based on what we're seeing in Ukraine. We're having critical infrastructure impacted. I mean, it's everywhere now, right? And in the defense industrial base where I operate, there's small machine shops, 30, 40-person shops that are critical suppliers of strategic weapons. This is a strategic national security problem, but it's felt all the way down at these very small companies who feel that burden of being told, for our national security, you all need to do this. Alicia, I wanted to tag you in here and ask, is there a sharing of the burden that should be explored, or is it just each organization's burden to operate in 2024 to implement good cybersecurity?
So I'm going to go on record and say I am a carrot stick person, so it's not an or for me. So that's going to dictate my answer here. And so I do think it's a shared responsibility. Government has a role to play. We may not be doing it to the best of our ability, but they have a role from a national security perspective, protecting public infrastructure. And then I think when we look at private industry, we often think about the private sector being more agile, more innovative, doing a better job of workforce development, for example. And so I think there's something to be gained and learned across the two. And I think for me, it's the 3P model, which is public-private partnership. And I would love to see us do more together. I don't think the burden is on the government alone to solve this problem. I think we all probably agree they probably cannot solve this problem alone, right? And so you do need that partnership. You do need private companies leaning in to help with the innovation that the government may not be well suited for. I think my colleagues shared that, yes, the government puts out a lot of regulations. I support these customers. Trust me, I hear it day and night that there's so many executive orders. Like, there's so many mandates. I can't keep up. There's zero trust. There's this, there's that. Those are the standards. But I think private companies can lean in and help with how to implement some of those things. And so I think we're starting to see more of that, but in order to get this right, which will take us time, we have to do more collaboration and partnership. So I'll go on record to say I'm a carrot stick person.
Eva, I want to ask you a follow-up, because you brought them into the equation, the big vendors in the space, the Microsofts, Amazons, those types of companies. Do they have a responsibility to take on more burden on behalf of the downstream sort of customers?
Yeah, so haven't I talked enough? No. I believe that they could do a better job. I think that they are poor. I think that a lot of software vendors are poor custodians of their customers. There are a lot of them out there that are that way. And I'm not beating up on any particular organization. I'm just saying, it's not Zscaler. I just want you guys to know that, right? So, and we did. I hope we gave you a great lunch. No, but seriously, I think that those organizations, the problem that we have is everybody is rushing forward to innovate something, right? So you look at the security industry the last 10 years. Look at how much change there's been, how many different products showed up, how hard it is to get those implemented, all the evaluations you have to do. Now look at large language models, right? And AI, right? So there's the next thing, and everybody jumps on that because that's where the VC money is, right? And so we're driving forward and driving forward and driving forward to create all this product to solve problems that a lot of people haven't even thought of yet, right? Or to, more importantly, to race us to the bottom and replace people who are currently working in whatever capacity. The same is true of any software company, which is that they're going to drive towards where the money is. Fixing bad code is not where the money is, right? New feature is where the money is, or new product is where the money is, or upgrades, or pick one. But it's definitely not fixing broken code. And so you have to hold them accountable, and I think that's a place where we have not done a good job in the public space, specifically with regulation, to say, okay, I mean, if you went and bought a baby crib and it collapsed on your child, you have recourse. Not only that, but there are products that the FTC is going to have something to say about it. If Microsoft crashes and somebody dies in a hospital, what does the FTC have to say to Microsoft? Nothing. The hospital's in trouble. Doctor might be in trouble. A number of people are in trouble. But is the vendor in trouble? Probably not. So it's something to think about.
I think it's interesting as I sit here and listen, coming at it from a different mind than my colleagues on the business side of the house. I hear everything coming back to money. And I would say the same thing. It costs money to be compliant. Companies make choices on investing. And maybe the question for this room, brilliant minds in the room, is how do we get the government and industry to think about it not in terms of money? Because if everybody's worried about their money, how much they have to spend, where they want to invest, how much they're going to have to pay if they get caught, then nobody's focusing on the problem, everybody's focusing on the money. Is there a way to change that mindset?
$1 million question.
There's lots of people here who's way smarter than me, and hopefully they can figure it out.
Well, listen, panel, you guys have been fantastic. I want to, with the few seconds we might have, take any questions if there are any out there.
Thank you all so much. This has been great. So still on money. One of the things I noticed is that a lot of the investment in cybersecurity is in the detection and kind of response areas, right? Like, so referring to the
That's the cool stuff.
right, the bells and whistles and the dings and the pings and all that kind of stuff, with less attention on identification and protection, right? Like that's the, I actually had an investor, I'm a cyber entrepreneur, I had an investor say, yeah, that stuff is boring that you're talking about, so it was more on the like, do you have anything that addresses ransomware? And I was like, oh, geez.
Can I just give you kudos real quick for contextualizing that with the cybersecurity framework? If you guys aren't familiar, the NIST CSF, phenomenal tool, great context.
Yeah, great tool. But I guess from you all's perspective, like, when we're talking about staying with money, it's just like in medicine, prevention, right, is a lot cheaper. Like, how do we change that narrative and that conversation where we can have more emphasis and investment being on the front side in the identification and the protection parts of that framework, instead of the after the fact where we're getting millions and even, in some case billions in a lot of this, response stuff especially? Like, how does that conversation change, and how does the investment change? Because I've seen the numbers, and the numbers are investing in the latter part of that framework.
Because so far, that's kind of all that's worked,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, at the end of the day, when you come back to comparing it to healthcare, healthcare prevention is driven by money. It's driven by the fact that there's huge amount of loss for insurance companies on sick individuals. So they try to keep people from getting sick. That's a focus, right? We hope. And given the fact that many of the things that they would be able to write off, they can no longer do so because of changes to the law. With respect to cybersecurity, unfortunately, proactive security, the dream of proactive security and preventative security is kind of just that, it's a dream. Detection and response, which is what I call last line defense, your typical EDR solution, that means that something got in, it's executing in the environment, and we picked it up. Good for us, but it got all the way down to beginning its process of taking over the organization or whatever the goal is. Those types of things, that's why all that investment is there. How do you change it? Somebody has to be on the hook for the result beyond just the company itself that's doing that. Companies will invest in that if there's a viable solution. But if you want to focus an entire industry or an entire country on the preventative aspects of cybersecurity, somebody's got to be on the hook for that, right? And right now, nobody's on the hook for that, right? It's not like the insurance industry who's on the hook. So just food for thought.
Yeah, I would just stick with your analogy on health for a second. And you said like the prevention part, right? That's the part where sometimes people will refer this market failure, right? There's something that's preventing people from making that a thing. And again, if money finds its way there, somehow that becomes proactive. So either you create the market for it, or you have someone try to fill that gap and say, we need that because the costs on this other side are just prohibitive. They're just not. I think we're getting that tipping point, to be honest. Look, like even despite all the conversation on money, there's not unlimited resources. And it's a pain point. At a certain point, a pain point moves people into action. Now, on the flip side of it, to say, again, do people understand without pain, let's say, without sort of that cost, what do we do on the front end of this? Why is that friction there? And I think this goes back to some design choices. I mean, I think we're used to being really taught that we don't want any friction. I have to literally, if I have to put in another password, I'm like, I'm done. I'm not going to do it. If I have to even look at another screen, I'm like, I'm not going to do it. It's sort of like eating your vegetables. No matter how much people tell you, you just don't eat your vegetables. People hide them now with their kids in these fancy, recipes and are like, just make sure they don't see them and they'll go down. And that's great. I mean, there are different ways to do this, but are we really also addressing the reason why? What is it about that friction that creates all of this sort of, I think, a dubious narrative, frankly, on what the costs are? And I think there's still folks I don't think really understand at a day-to-day level. This is not like abstracting a company level. I do think at the end of the day, it's a collection of humans. People have to understand what are the costs associated with it. We also live in a world where we didn't talk about this, I think, enough, but the privacy element of this. I mean, the way we sort of talk about here in the United States, the fact that, sort of data is just out there in the world. We made those trade-offs at the beginning. We don't have the similar, now we're sort of paying attention. But I think, again, it's a lot of ways in which we've been socialized to believe how we just get online. And I still believe that's baked into a lot of these systems on then, what are the pain points? How do we do this? Again, why do boards care about certain things? Why do VCs care about certain things? What questions you're going to get? It's because we've been socialized about how we actually use this tool, just like you would be about, your preventative care. So.
Awesome, great question. Last note before we let everyone go, just a reminder, there is a giveaway today. They put the Google form up. Make sure you guys sign up for that. That is Dr. Nikki Robinson's book. There are 10 of them going out today. I believe at 3 o'clock time, the coffee time, we'll announce those winners, and then she will be at the after party to sign said books, so please stick around. A big round of applause for our panel again, please. Great job.